you're like,
Oh,
okay. Awesome. So, yeah, what I wanted to, since you are familiar with what I am proposing in terms of materiality, and because what you just described is so connected to this, like the difference between what a company might say is, ESG oriented. Sorry, I'm like leaning to look at my other monitor here. What a company might say is ESG, they've checked the box, they really are pointed in the right direction, versus actually sustainable and actually creating the future we want. What I'm going to do is share my screen. Tell me if you see, do you see the slide, the process slide that's kind of comparing old materiality and new materiality? Okay. So the very point you were just describing is what I'm trying to do with, I'm just going to skip right to the middle of the process, where the way most of ESG is unfolding now, at least that I see in the reporting and transparency trenches in mostly large publicly traded companies, the way they describe the stuff in their ESG reports is based on what they've determined to be material. And it's in this kind of disaggregated way, right? It's sort of, let's figure out what our issues are and then talk about them in this report. Whereas, and so that's what this issue identification step is here, that I know you've had a chance to glance at before this conversation. What I'm trying to home in on, or kind of prompt us to go towards, is to say, well, we actually kind of already know, at least generally, what needs to happen. We need, healthy ecosystems and thriving society. And so if what you, company, are doing isn't contributing to that, or worse, if it's actually undermining that, then that's really what's material. And that's really what you need to be looking at. So I raise that because as you're describing the regulatory piece, I feel like, it's maybe still not getting at that nuance. So, and does that feel true to you? You were just kind of talking through some of the sort of screens and filters that are happening.
Yes, I mean, everything that I spoke about before we clicked record on was because I had watched the video and had seen this slide and was saying, yes, this is what we're experiencing in the real world, on the challenges every day that we have with how ESG and sustainability are clumped together. But when it comes to the contribution to ecosystems and society, again, there's no vision of what we are trying to move towards as the North Star. We don't have a compass to navigate our way towards what kind of ecosystems we want and how much space for nature is enough space for nature. Hi, darling, can you shut my door? Thanks. My son's home. And we also, do you remember with Region X, we talked about bioregional context as well. So saying, unlike climate change, where you can have that North Star of, we're aiming to limit global warming to 1.5 degree, and there's a whole mathematical, scientific, roadmap to achieve that, and we all have to just get in line and do our bit. And there's not that sort of figure at a global level, at least, for ecosystems, and there's not there are metrics for ecosystem health and things, but they're so nuanced and so specific to the area that you're in, the latitude, longitude, at how high you are above sea level, what the sort of dynamics are and the interplay between different pressures and species, etc. There's no way that you can say we're heading towards X. Although I would argue that something like the Bonn Challenge, where you have countries at a country by country level saying, we are going to put X million hectares into restoration by the year 2030, or we are going to restore X million hectares by the year 2030, that actually gives you some sort of framework at a country level, because when I say you're Ghana and you've said, right, 0.6 million hectares within our country is going to be restored, and that's our target, at least then everybody can sort of use that as the objective, and that can be set at a country level, and then everybody else sort of has to fall in line behind that, and it's got to be decided what the ecological integrity that we're aiming for the ecosystems to be deemed restored is going to be, and often you can't restore ecosystems within that time frame anyway. So it's just a question of saying we are putting those hectares into restoration, and that's going to be sort of designated as landscape area that is going to be stewarded with nature in mind, you know. So I think that's the main problem on the ecosystems side, is trying to say the only real metric that people could probably rally behind is creating more space, more landscape area that is stewarded with nature in mind, you know, and all the other metrics have to sort of fall behind that.
Yeah, okay, so I want to riff on what I've been learning with the Google assessment, actually, but I'm just going to take a step back since we did hit record, and in case we decide to do something useful and public with this, I'll just ask if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourself, in particular, your expertise and your sort of current space that you're moving in, because it's just such an interesting lens to be exploring this wider materiality topic. So yeah, who are you?
Oh, hi, I am Eva Vogt, and I always introduce myself as someone who's had a sort of broad background in sustainability and sustainable development, having sort of studied a master's in leadership for sustainable development probably around 20 years ago now, and then worked in CSR consultancy, worked for the Environment Agency, for the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Environment Agency when I was first starting out, and then worked also in landscape restoration, worked for NGOs, have worked for the Sustainable Development Commission in government, and have worked in engineering firms. So across many different sectors and professions, have always been sort of applying the lens of sustainable development or sustainability, or what does sustainability, what sort of sustainability linked objectives should we have in different case studies, whether it be a business or a project or at a building level. And then most recently, I now work as the head of ESG and impact in a private equity firm, which is a global private equity firm. I'm based in Jersey and the Channel Islands. And on a day-to-day level, I am helping the companies that are within our portfolio that we've invested in, which we're majority shareholders in all of them, with their own sustainable business strategies, as well as their ESG. And through this role, I'm seeing that there's lots of different dimensions to that. The sort of dimension that has historically been labelled as ESG, which is a large part of it, risk and compliance, with local laws, regulations, and also international standards in countries where perhaps the laws are lacking or not enforced. But then there's also this huge sort of value creation that comes from efficiencies and better risk management and better access to credit at better rates, that you can have if you have all the sort of ESG KPIs, performance indicators, and you have a good trajectory of performance, whether it is related to greenhouse gas emissions or, your employee culture, employee satisfaction, retention, attrition rates, those sorts of things, health and safety stats. I mean, that's the traditional sort of ESG side of things. But then ESG and sustainability, as we talked earlier, seems to be sort of used as terms interchangeably, certainly in the finance space, which of course they're not, which is probably what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah, well, I'd love to touch on that and pull that apart. I'll also just disclose that you and I know each other because we met through the Global Regeneration Collab, and among other chats and side conversations, we had the pleasure of working side by side virtually on the RegenX project, which I might actually link in this materiality stuff, but suffice to say, we collaborated on what would you call that? Like a rapid innovation project to sort of hack ESG using artificial intelligence and the notion of a regenerative economy. So in a way, I feel like that RegenX project was like the early seed that led me to sort of wander off the trail and do this materiality or reality-based materiality project without any tech other than Google Slides. This is about as scruffy and kind of homespun as it gets, which is a bit more my speed. But yeah, let's go into the difference between ESG and sustainability, and I'll circle back now to where I was going a few minutes ago with Google and how you were talking about setting land aside in Ghana, for example. And I'm going to describe how I understand things happening just sort of in the world. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts about, well, how does that play out in terms of ESG and what companies actually need to do or not do? And I don't have a predefined answer, and I think it's actually like an impossible question as usual, but I'm gonna paint it anyway. So let's say Ghana, or frankly Canada, sets aside land and says this land is to be restored. It's been degraded because of erosion through deforestation or some other thing has caused the land to be so-called degraded. We're now going to earmark it for restoration. And we've hit a certain number of hundreds of thousands of acres, and that's that. And that's towards our, let's say, ecosystem health target, being super vague here. Okay, that's the kind of national level, perhaps regulatory scene. But then you have a company like Google, whose business model today, they earned over 250 billion US in 2021. And the vast majority of that, in the ballpark of 80% of that revenue, came from advertising. So they make money by selling advertising different ways, but it amounts to forms of advertising through the online universe. So how do Google and land restoration meet? And at the moment, I would suggest, just based on what I'm seeing so far looking at Google stuff, most of how it meets is through initiatives, right? Like supporting community action and or the employee base that might volunteer here or there, obviously following the laws, so not building something really nasty in the middle of that preserved space, but otherwise it's sort of business as usual over here, and we're going to do some kind of nice stuff here. And we were going to explore, and we're sort of pausing for the moment, TD Bank, but FYI, TD here in Canada is known for a lot of like greening activity. So they do a lot of like tree planting and things that are really nice for the environment that have nothing to do with their business model. So now if we circle back to what is effective ESG, and what does it have to do with sustainability and a company's actual business model, like how they actually make money, and how do you, Eva, in your role, kind of even discern that and communicate it in a way that investors or fund managers can do anything about that's even remotely likely to enable ecosystem restoration, much less thriving societies? So it's a super loaded question, but I'd love to hear your reflections on what you're seeing in terms of real change at the business model level.
Yeah, I know that's not fair because there's so many questions in what you just
I know. You can cherry pick. And I pulled down the slides that I had up, but if it's useful to kind of point and reference, I'm happy to pull some of them back up. But I'm also just thinking you've got a lot of vision and knowledge in your own head.
Okay, so let me go back to, first of all, the Ghana point and the landscape restoration. So it wouldn't be setting aside land to be restored. It would be, the land could still have multiple use cases. So it might be agricultural, but it would just mean that you would have to say, at the minute, this land that is being used for agriculture is on a downward degenerative trajectory. And, you know, like you could say, you know, the farming in the US, what is there, 60 soil cycles or something left? And also in the UK, like the quality of the soil continues to degenerate until it's dust and you can't farm it anymore. So if you said, okay, well, we're incorporating the farmland into our restoration target, then you would have specific targets that you're going to be working towards in terms of soil health, in terms of the biodiversity that is enabled to also thrive within these landscapes. So it's not a case of just saying, right, sorry, lads, everyone off the land because this is designated restoration. And that does happen, but it shouldn't. You know, this is designated now for restoration. There's no humans allowed here because you're just going to continue to erode the ecological integrity. It's about saying, how can we go about what we need to go about, but in a more sensitive way and inclusive of natural systems, natural ecosystems, and key species, and, you know, all the health from the soils to the keystone species. So so that's on that point. Just wanted to clarify what I meant by hectares of land that were designated to be restored. And then in answer to your question about Google and saying, okay, well, you know, 80% of its impact, or maybe even more than that, is related to advertising. And Solitaire Townsend, I don't know if you've come across her from
Sure, yeah.
She did a recent her TED talk, which she knows I'm a fan of, where she talks about Scope X, which is essentially, and she's relating this to the advertising industry. It's about who are the clients you're taking on and what is their impact. So you know, it's not sustainability and ESG. Maybe if you're in advertising, is not, you know, whether you provide healthy lunches to your employees in your canteen. It is whose businesses are you perpetuating, and are they actually part of the solution or part of the problem? Where do they have a place in a sustainable future, or are they just contributing to the continued degradation of, you know, climate, if you're advertising for fossil fuel businesses, etc. So actually you could do some sort of analysis in terms of looking at the industry sectors, first of all, maybe that Google is enabling advertisements to be placed for, and you could get a pretty good idea of what their Scope X would be. But just on that front, like her TED talk really lays it out, what the argument is there for looking at advertising agencies' impact, and in fact all professional services, or whether you're a lawyer or, you know, whose corner are you fighting, and what are going to be the results from supporting those cases. So that's what she terms of ScopeX, which I think is a useful concept.
Yeah, that's terrific. And actually, I will make a note of including a link to that, certainly in the notes of this video, if this ends up going into the public materiality space, and then also in the Google materiality assessment that I'm doing. That sounds like a really great trail. And I don't know if you remember when we were doing RegenX, we were talking about ScopeX. So ScopeX has been in the ether for a while because a lot of us have been aware you can calculate more or less scopes 1, 2, and 3, but even then that stays bounded within a space that misses, frankly, the point. And so we keep coming to this. So I'm excited to give that a listen and see where it goes. And it feels very aligned with the prompt that leads me to be doing this exploration. So that's really cool. And I have had the pleasure of meeting Solly, and I have a lot of respect for her work. So looking forward to seeing that. That's cool. Thanks for that.
Great. So what's the next part? What's the next question to chew off? I only made those 2 points.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd be curious, from as much as you can comfortably say, and tell me if I should pause the recording, but given your role, I'd say sort of inside the ESG digester, if you will, how do you or can you discern between sort of ESG boxes, like they have a human rights policy or a diversity policy, important things that of course we care about. We wouldn't say like never have those things, those are stupid, but that don't get at this bigger vision of what is the future we would like to see, and how do we know that we're designing ourselves and executing on our design in such a way that moves us towards that. So can you, I don't know, share what it looks like from your perspective?
Yeah. So I see a lot of the sort of ESG framework, if you like, as hygiene factors, things that all businesses should have. A whole program of work based around ESG things like, have you got a carbon reduction plan in place? Have you set science-based targets? Have you got a human rights policy? Are you upholding the UNGC principles, and have you got policies and procedures in place to do that? I mean, many of the things, in fact, I've got them listed in front of me, the sort of principal adverse impacts that are listed out under the European SFDR, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, which is looking at, the greenhouse gas intensity of companies, the gender pay gap. These are all hygiene factors, to make sure that you are de-risking the company. So whether it be climate risks, human rights violations, or reputational risks, this is all about de-risking. And then, in my work, we have that across the board, the sort of hygiene factors. And those are really being dictated as to what those are by the regulatory market, what should be included in your ESG framework across the board. And then we will develop, because we invest across different types of businesses, different types of industries, we have bespoke ESG frameworks for each and every portfolio company, depending on their sector, their geographical spread, how big or small they are, their ambition in relation to sustainability as well. So, but then also, I thought, well, that's all great to have this framework, but I felt that what we really needed was to use the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals to not to have a sort of rainbow report of, the fact that somebody's got an anti-bribery and corruption policy in place means that they are contributing to some SDG. Really to say, well, if we look at the business model or significant product lines of every single business that we're investing in, are those business models aligned to contributing towards one of the Sustainable Development Goals? And if so, how do you qualify that? and can you quantify it? So in the instance of I think I mentioned the largest European recycling BPO in Europe that we have within our portfolio, that would be saying, well, they're contributing towards a circular economy, they're contributing towards SDG 12, responsible consumption, responsible consumption and production. And how are they doing that? Well, they're diverting waste from landfill. They are keeping resources in circulation for longer. And how can we measure the sort of impact that they're having? Well, we can measure their diversion from landfill rate. We can measure how many tons of waste they're processing year on year. This particular company happens to have a social value program, and through something called the National TOMS framework, which is a framework in the UK that has been developed to basically quantify in pounds the amount of social value that's being generated by a company's social value program. You can put a dollar figure on that, or a pound figure on that rather. So and that's what I think our investors are most interested in. Sure, they want to know the hygiene factor, check, and that's there's systems and processes and policies in place to de-risk the company. But really, they want to know, where's this fit in society at a systemic level, and what is the contribution? Oh, I would use impact, but then I think there's quite prescribed ways for communicating on impact, like the Impact Management Project is creating a framework on how you should really be communicating on impact. But I use contribution instead because it's a bit less hard and fast. I think that's more interesting and more relevant to the investors to know that they're investing in a business or a fund that has a portfolio of businesses where 80% of them, their business model is linked to some SDG, because I know they're higher education company, they're a mental health company, they are a recycling company. All of those types of businesses we have in our portfolio, and we try and link core value creation KPIs to those SDGs to try to quantify where we can the contribution that they're making. So that's as far as I've got in terms of linking the businesses to sustainability. So it's using the SDGs, but obviously, as you discussed in your previous video, there are limitations to that, to using the SDGs even. And we still don't really account for the scope X factor.
I was just going to ask about that. Could you say a bit more about just how you understand scope X applying, say, to that recycling company, realizing it's not part of how things are measured just yet?
Probably not. That's probably where I can't.
Okay, yeah.
Discuss in too much detail that. But for instance, let's say that I'm trying to think of a hypothetical example. I can't think of one off the cuff. Can you think of based on the example that I shared with you, can you think of a hypothetical one?
Yeah, or maybe it's easier to almost back into the void, because what I think I'm realizing in hearing your experience and what goes on is that, like, even the companies that really legitimately check a lot of meaningful SDG oriented boxes and social and environmental impact and contribution boxes are not doing so from a place of, because this is the future we want. They're doing so understandably from a business proposition, this is what we do for a living around here. Oh, and oh, look, we can align it with these other things. And that's not necessarily terrible, but it's very different than saying what we set out to do is leave a legacy of improved biodiversity. You know, that is a dramatically different vision than what we set out to do was keep materials in circulation. And one of the benefits of that is reduce greenhouse gas emissions on behalf of the industries that we support, neutral to what those industries are. You know, we'll be a bit vague here, but people can use their imaginations. Like, every industry produces waste. It's a great idea to reduce it and keep materials in flow and in value for as long as possible. And some of those industries are problematic by definition, and their vision for the future is not restored ecosystems. So maybe just in the interest of time and knowing you and I could talk and solve all of the world's problems if we just had a little bit more time. But I wonder, to switch gears a bit, would you share how, like, what's your vision for the future? What would you like to see as a result of, you know, industry really doing what it could be doing? What does it look like?
I think I won't go full on fantasy yet, but one of the first things that I can see happening in relation to things like the TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is, and this is what I hope, is that there will be a lot more knowledge about exposures to risk for the company, including reputational risk, because of the impact that they have on nature throughout their supply chain. So let me give an example. This is a real example, but I won't name any names. So let's say there's a carbon offset project in South America, and the forest that once was there has been converted to soy and beef farming, and there is a forest code in Brazil, and it requires, I think, either 10 or 20% of farmland to be reforested actively. It's not enforced at all, and frankly, you know, the farmers may not have capacity or finance, certainly don't have the finance to restore 20% of their farmland. So there are NGOs that come in and say, we'll restore it for you. We've got the capacity, we've got the know-how, we've got the skilled people we've trained, we've got the nurseries set up, and we'll come and we'll restore it, and we'll, for the remaining fragments of forest that exist that have red listed species there that are under threat of extinction, will create more habitat area for these forests. And they are financed, the NGO is financed to do this through selling offsets to financial institutions or corporates or whoever wants to buy them to offset the emissions from their own businesses. So those companies overseas are paying for the farmers to be in compliance with the law. Okay, so the farmers are obligated under the law to reforest 20% of their land. They can't afford to do that, so the NGO comes in. The NGO is funded to do that by people outside, because it wouldn't get done otherwise. What with the TNFD, if the financial institutions or the investors who are financing the beef and soy conglomerates were to trail down and find that actually the cattle or soy that they are sourcing, the areas, the landscapes that they're sourcing the commodities from, within those landscapes, it's so degraded and they are in close proximity to these species that are going extinct. You would have thought that that company would then be exposed to nature-related risk, because it's having, okay, it's not necessarily going to be a risk for the company straight off, because that's been happening for a long, long time. But it certainly is having an impact on nature, because whilst that land is in beef and soy production and eroding the last fragments of forest that exist in the area, it is putting pressure on that IUCN red listed species, which is deemed as a risk to the company. So therefore, should the beef and soy company not say, well, we need to channel some investment down to the NGO who's doing the restoration, and rather than that NGO being an NGO, that NGO is now providing a service to that soy and beef company, because what they're doing is shoring up the ecological integrity of the landscapes by being paid by those companies to actively restore the 20% of land and ensure that the farmers that they're sourcing from are in compliance with the forest code. And so it shouldn't be that companies overseas are paying for their offsets to try and pay an NGO to restore forests. It should be that the companies that are which are exploiting the landscapes and having all these impacts as being externalities are forced to bring them onto their balance sheet, because it is something that is recognized as being suddenly their nature-related risk in their supply chain, because their commodities are putting pressure on the IUCN red listed species, or degrading areas of land, or just keeping areas of land in degradation. So if, let's say it was the state of Sao Paulo, and the forest fell within that, and Sao Paulo had said, we're restoring, 50% of this forest land. If your commodity is undermining that objective because it's maintaining this as like vast swathes of cattle ranching area, then that's also a risk all of a sudden, because you're not, your commodity is not in keeping with the national objective, and therefore how do you balance that? How do you start ensuring that the forest code is adhered to within your supply chain, so that you can be seen as part of the contributing solution rather than perpetuating the problem?
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting when you talk about the forest code in Brazil. As you know, I've had a chance to work and collaborate with a few folks in Brazil. And I remember one stakeholder pointing out early on, because people like to critique, Brazil, they're cutting down the rainforest. And one fellow pointed out, he said, imagine if a beef, or a cattle farmer in Texas was required to restore 20% of the degraded land. Like, it would be laughable. It'd just be like, don't tell me what to do with my land. So we, I also, this is just a kind of blunt statement, but like, we deforested our land here in Canada so long ago. Actually, isn't that long ago, but it's out of my living memory.
Yeah.
So
it's like, well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you guys did it way earlier.
Right? That's the other thing. So one of the things about nature-related risk is, one of the key things is, are you putting pressure on IUCN red listed species? Well, that's the baseline that you're using. You're saying, what's left? How do we protect it? Yeah. And you're not finding what the baseline, what the benchmark needs to be.
Right.
We've as you said, we've been born into a landscape, and certainly in the UK as well, the quaint English countryside, which is basically an ecological desert.
Yeah, it's
and,
a clear cut with
yeah,
pre-slaughtered meat products grazing on it, you know.
yeah. So indeed, why should you know, that be the defining watershed that, you know, or you're going to push a species over the edge of extinction? Well, species been going extinct for years, and we've lost most of the ones that were indigenous to our own country, and we've cleared our landscapes of wolves and lynx and European bison and all the rest of it, which, you know, there are projects where individual organizations are trying to rewild pockets
Rewilding, yeah.
of landscapes, and I work with some of those organizations as well. But yeah, it's like, and this is the missing point. This is the thing that's missing, is saying what. And Common Land, so Common Land does a good job of this. They have something where they will bring stakeholders together around a landscape and say, this is our landscape, this is our boundary. What are our aspirations in terms of this landscape? How do we balance land use? How do we, you know, what is your vision for this landscape? And interestingly, they say with all the projects that they've worked on first, one of the first things that the stakeholders say is, well, we've got to create enough space for nature, you know, and they want to maintain this area, it's going to just stay natural. And that's the first thing that they ask for. Secondly, it's like balancing industry and leisure and recreation, etc., housing. But yeah, I think, and that's the thing, that's why you can't really do it at a global level other than avoiding crises, and only at a regional level can you stipulate what are our aspirations for this. And we talked about whether actually you look at, you know, biomes and bioregions and actually start saying, well, is that a good sort of bird's eye view to, and spatially, is that a good area to look at, like a bioregion or a biome, as opposed to, you know, dissecting it into country by country. But maybe country by country is more practical because we obviously have the political and leadership boundaries and things. But if we could, it would be really good to look at bioregions. And what is a healthy bioregion? What does a sort of good level of ecological integrity look like for this, that can perpetuate a decent standard of living into the future? So it's not going to turn to desert, or it's not going to just become ecologically dysfunctional and degraded. You know, that's got to be the baseline, isn't it? But nobody's sort of coming along and setting those. Well, they might be. There might be completely my ignorance. There might be, you know, someone who's got a global plan, or at least a bioregional plan of what this really should look like to be healthy, and to have us integrated into that, and our system aligned to, you know, us as a, you know, us as part of that system, because we should be stewarding that. We should be the guardians that are facilitating that level of health for ourselves and for the landscapes and for the ecosystems, and, you know, breathing life into things rather than exploiting.
Yeah, I'm also not aware of anybody sort of signaling that at the level we're talking about here, sort of major financiers and kind of regulatory decision makers. For sure, there's people thinking about it. You know some of them, and I know some of them, people really thinking very far ahead and thinking on behalf of the biosphere or bioregions. But frankly, again, like you're sort of poking at the sore spot of the corporate behavior that you and I have been dancing with for a number of years, which is that is lacking in corporate thinking. I think is lacking in the corporate mindset. I see it all. I'm glad to hear you bring up the TNFD, and I'll make sure there's clear links to that as well. I was kind of poking around in their interim, the latest published stuff, which, you know, the practical corporate person in me really appreciates and respects, and I can just imagine the level of complexity just to get it to where they've gotten it. You know, it's no small thing. It's a lot of different people from different parts of the world, different sectors. Organizing anything like a birthday party is complicated these days, but organizing something like an interim version of the task force on nature related financial disclosures, that's massive. And when I looked at the definition of nature, I got a little bit uncomfortable. And it highlighted for me why we even need this task force, and why the way it's set up right now, I'll just go on the record here and say, I think it's set up to fail more than spectacularly. I think there's a possibility of it changing and evolving, so it won't necessarily fail. But the way it's designed right now to state, and I'm paraphrasing based on memory, but it's something like, you know, at its foundation is an understanding of nature. And then you look at the understanding of nature and it just belies our separateness, and how nature is, again, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially for human benefit. And so we need to manage the resource in such a way that we don't lose. Mm-hmm. And that's how we got here. Like, I love your sense around stewardship. And I think there are many great examples of cultures, past and present, that have had a stewardship model and being part of natural systems, and definitely affected them on a macro level. It hasn't all just been, you know, hoping things work out and then collecting some fish and rainwater. It's been active stewardship, active engagement, and to a degree manipulation. I don't think that's out of the question, but to sort of have as a foundational principle that nature is for our benefit and a resource, it's even a linguistic failure. So I think there's opportunity to evolve that. But yeah, sorry, did you want to jump in?
No, I just said it's like it's a mindset.
And
it shows the huge gap.
That's right.
You look at sort of in Indigenous communities and cultures, and the difference in discourse of and how they perceive things, anything really, you know, like it just shows the sort of cultural influence and mentality that is developed. I mean, I really struggle with it still. It's like adopting a language. It's like learning a new language and trying to make sense of it in the real world, because I find just talking, you know, using the language that we use in business and sort of externalities and internalities and you know, ecosystem services, and rather than I often use ecosystem functionality rather than ecosystem services, because it's not like all life has to be in service or
in service.
It's like trying to bring everything into the balance sheet. Some things must just be sacred. No, and I just see less and less sacredness in things. That's almost the thing that is lost, which would really, you know, be sort of the code of ethics of life, isn't it? If you could link things back to, well, some things are just sacred and some things that just are, but that doesn't fit into the
it's the I'll offer a quick comment on that, and then a final question, and we'll give you back your afternoon there. I noticed in the verbiage of the TNFD a reference to ways in which these new principles and practices can and must be practical in a business context. And I'm coming to see the word practical as a bit of a dirty word, because it, you know, as we've been talking about here, if you stand way back, it is highly impractical to have a completely failing soil system, right? Like that is not practical, especially if you want to grow things and eat them. But that level of practical is kind of like still in the externality bucket. And what we're really saying in the current round of the TNFD is that it has to be practical, like businesses need to be able to do something about it. And to be super blunt, that is why I am tinkering unfunded in the edges here in this reality-based materiality project, because if I have to stay practical for one more minute, I'm going to lose my mind. It's like, it's not practical to come up with a long list of issues and say, this is what your ESG disclosures amount to, when you're setting the world on fire, not in a happy rock and roll way, right? Like, that's not practical. So when people ask me, you know, but what do you want companies to do with this? I'm like, I don't know, but I think it's important to tell the truth. I think that's actually practical. So
the materiality check.
Exactly. Like, if your materiality isn't based in reality, and anybody, you know, give me a call. I'm happy to go in great detail on or off the record about materiality that I've seen that is not based in reality practically. That's what I think we have the opportunity to change. So that was just a little pressure valve that accidentally slipped open in my mind. Last question for you. I'm going to ask you to circle back to something you briefly alluded to, and if you will, if you'll go into more detail, which is, you said in response to the future you want, you said, I won't go into sort of the fantasy just yet. And then you talked about some of the really interesting real practicalities of what it looks like when a business meaningfully takes responsibility for their, you know, bioregional and ecosystem impacts. And I think that's a beautiful piece of the future I want to be in. What if you did go into the fantasy space for a bit and just riff on, like, what would you love to see and what would you feel great about knowing is sort of coming down the line?
I think I can only really do that for my own, within my own community, or let's say the UK, right? Because I couldn't really do it for any other place, because it's not my place physically, or, you know, literally or otherwise to comment what that should be like. But, you know, there are lots of things that I would change locally about my own island. And I live in Jersey, in the Channel Islands, obviously. There, you know, in terms of how everything is planned, how the amount of space, again, that's given to nature, which, and amount of space that is farming, and most of our stuff is exported. So actually, as a citizen on the island, you know, we're giving away the island's land to farming. I'm not very popular for anybody's ideas, probably. I would have a lot less cars on the road. I'd just have, you know, most of the space on the roads set aside for cycling, to enable my children. You know, we get these surveys through all the time, like, what would make your children able to cycle to school, or, you know, have another mode of transport. And it's, the roads are just too dangerous, and also it's not really very healthy, because they're just breathing in so many car fumes, and you're exposing them to more risks, and than actually being something that's beneficial to them. So until that switches, and that would be around segregating, you know, children from children cycling from vehicles, it's unlikely to happen, because the roads are pretty dangerous. They're small and windy, and people go fast. But, you know, I'm bringing it right back to local, like local context, local things. And we do have sometimes ideation groups that come together and say, you know, what is this place? What is our identity? What do we want? What do we as citizens want for this island? And those are really interesting. But again, lots of different groups having lots of different ideas, people's livelihoods potentially being questioned, or threatened in some way just through the ideation process. So it's really emotive, and but yeah, there's all sorts of things that, you know, even education, you do education differently and that sort of thing. So
how would education be? What would be different?
Well, that's a really big question, Lorraine.
Oh, top line. 10 seconds of Eva's future education world.
I think that there's a huge segregation of age groups, so that the children can't learn from one another, which I think is probably the most natural way of learning. I think that we as parents are segregated, like grown-ups are segregated from the children, but there's reasons for that, from around safeguarding, etc. But there's not. It's very much still a sort of less. It's not a community experience. It's the whole sort of departing knowledge, assimilation of knowledge, pumped through exams, and I don't think it's good for mental health of children. And I don't know if it, you know, are we preparing them for the right future? What future are we preparing them for? Are these skills that they are developing right now going to be relevant for survival in the future job market, the future world that they find themselves in, with all the sort of creative subjects being axed more and more, or funding for cultural stuff being axed more and more. You know, those are the sorts of things that I think probably will save us in the future. Not save us, but you know, potentially. You know, coming up with solutions to things, thinking of the world from different perspectives, and it's not we just breeding the mindset that is needed, you know, to align with the corporate world as it is now. So
I love it. I want to go to your school. I want to make sure we wrap up on time here, so I'm going to pause the recording here with huge thank you for all of this. Just before I hit pause, any like quick parting words? I'll keep it live, but like I'll keep us live, but any quick on the record last thought?
The last thoughts, I guess, around the whole sustainability piece was I was thinking recently more about the donut economics model, and the fact that actually if you do apply it to a place-based exercise, you know, like they're doing with the cities and things, you can look at the boundaries and the loading of, you know, different environmental aspects, or look at the social foundations for the different social aspects at a place-based level. And so that was going some way into using a framework within a place space and inputs and outputs that are real at a micro level rather than a global level. You know, what can our global Earth systems tolerate is sort of the donut economics model. But when you bring it down to a place space area, it's quite a good compass to use to put development on a trajectory that is more sustainability orientated. I guess final word.
Cool. Thank you, Eva. Really great to connect here more soon. I'm going to pause here.